Over 19,000 confidential images and videos, extracted from top-secret meetings, classified files, and even the crisis rooms of Israel's military general staff. That is not a headline from a thriller novel. That is what happened just days ago, on April 9, 2026, when the Iranian-linked hacker group known as Handala dropped one of the most consequential cyber intelligence dumps in the history of the Middle East conflict. And here is what you need to understand right now, before the mainstream narrative buries the real story under a mountain of spin. This is not just about one man's personal photos. This is about the architecture of modern warfare, the collapse of the illusion of security at the highest levels of military command, and what it reveals about who actually holds power in this increasingly volatile world. The key difference this time is the scale of the material. The volume of information could provide a broad intelligence picture far beyond mere personal harassment. The man at the center of this, former IDF Chief of Staff Lieutenant General Herzi Halevi, is not a peripheral figure. He commanded Israel's armed forces for over 2 years, guiding military operations through the most intense period of conflict the region has seen in decades. And now, according to all available evidence, his phone was an open book to Tehran for years. So let's sit with that for a moment, because the implications run very, very deep. The authenticity of the breach was confirmed by an Israeli source familiar with the matter, who told CNN that the photos published by Handala were genuine. However, Halevi's own representatives have declined to comment on the incident, maintaining official silence as the story continues to unfold. That silence is itself a statement. When a government or a military establishment goes quiet in the face of an accusation this serious, it is almost never because the accusation is false. It is because they do not have an answer that does not make the situation worse. And so they say nothing, and they hope the news cycle moves on. But let's not let it move on, because what we are looking at here is something that fundamentally changes how we have to think about intelligence, about digital vulnerability, and about the nature of warfare in the 21st century. Think about what was actually in those files. The leaked materials include photos of Halevi's and his wife's passports, images of him during visits to Israeli military facilities, and documentation of meetings with key figures such as former U.S. Central Command Chief Michael Kurilla. In one undated photo, reportedly taken in Qatar, Halevi is seen in a meeting with Kurilla, with a portrait of Qatar's emir visible in the background. Other images show Halevi touring the Sheikh Zayed Mosque in Abu Dhabi and meeting with Jordan's military chief, Youssef Huneyti. Now let that sink in. A secret meeting in Qatar between the top Israeli military commander and the head of United States Central Command, one of the most sensitive military relationships on the planet, was photographed, archived, and is now sitting in Handala's servers. A previously undisclosed visit to Jordan, secret flights on business jets, the crisis rooms, the maps, the faces of pilots and special forces operators whose identities the IDF itself goes to extraordinary lengths to protect, pixelating their faces in official photos, all of it unredacted in the hands of Iranian intelligence. The hackers said the material in their possession does not consist only of documents, but also live visual records from what they described as crisis rooms and highly secret facilities. They said that, unlike IDF censors, who often obscure the faces of officers and pilots, they possess thousands of fully exposed images of fighters and commanders at the highest ranks. This is the part that should make anyone who thinks seriously about geopolitics stop and reconsider their assumptions. Because if true, and the evidence strongly suggests it is, then Iran was not just reading documents, Iran was watching. In real time, for years, during a war, they were sitting inside the system of the man running that war, watching him plan, watching him meet, watching him travel, watching him in his own home, with his family, and nobody knew. Now let's talk about who Handala actually is, because this is where the mainstream coverage tends to get lazy and misleading. The U.S. Justice Department has assessed Handala as a front for Iran's Ministry of Intelligence and Security, not an independent hacktivist group. The FBI said the group is run by an MOS unit, also responsible for other Iranian intelligence personas. So when you hear the word hackers, do not picture a group of idealistic young programmers sitting in a basement somewhere. Picture a structured, state-funded intelligence operation with resources, patience, and long-term strategic goals. The group claims to be an independent, pro-Palestinian hacktivist collective, but instead serves as a front for Iran's Ministry of Intelligence and Security. The distinction matters enormously, because it means every leak, every data dump, every carefully timed release is a decision made at the level of Iranian state intelligence. The timing is deliberate. The targets are deliberate. The psychological framing is deliberate. And speaking of timing, the timing of the disclosure, one day after the announcement of a ceasefire by US President Donald Trump, has drawn attention within Israel's defense community. The release is widely being interpreted not only as an intelligence operation, but as part of a broader psychological campaign aimed at undermining confidence among senior military leadership. So we have a ceasefire announcement, followed almost immediately by the release of classified files from Israel's former top military commander. You do not have to be a professional intelligence analyst to understand what message is being sent here. Iran is saying, even as you negotiate, even as you claim victory, even as you try to manage the narrative, we are inside your command structure. We were always inside. We choose when you find out. That is a profoundly destabilizing message, and it is delivered not with a missile, but with a file dump. This is the new battlefield, and it is operating at a level of sophistication that the American public deserves to understand far better than they currently do. Handala first appeared in December 2023 following the October 7 attacks. During the 2026 Iran war, it was responsible for the wiping attack through Microsoft Intune against Stryker Corporation. It was reported to have been the most significant wartime cyber attack on the United States. Let's dwell on that for a moment. The most significant wartime cyber attack on the United States, not on Israel, on the United States. An Iran-linked group calling itself Handala claimed responsibility for a cyber attack on a Michigan-based medical device maker Stryker Corp. The cyber attack affected Stryker's internal Microsoft software system, disrupting the company's order processing, manufacturing, and shipping. This is a company that makes equipment used by hospitals across the country. This is a company that supplies the American medical system. Handala said that it destroyed over 200,000 of Stryker's systems and devices across 79 countries, forcing tens of thousands of employees to be sent home. So the war that Washington and Tel Aviv launched with airstrikes and missiles came back, not with an Iranian missile landing on an American city, but with a digital strike that hit a hospital supply chain in Michigan. That is how asymmetric warfare works in the modern era. And it is something that requires a fundamentally different kind of thinking than we have been applying to these conflicts. Much of Iranian cyber activity serves to exhaust cyber defenders and undercut political will for the war in Iran among the US public, the bedrock of Iran's asymmetric warfare strategy. Read that sentence again, because it is one of the most honest things any analyst has said about what is happening right now. The goal is not to defeat the United States militarily. The goal is to exhaust the American public, to make the cost of this conflict feel real and personal and domestic, to shift the psychology at home, because Iran understands something that Washington's war planners have consistently underestimated, that in a democratic society, the most vulnerable point is not the military, it's the will of the people. And if you can make ordinary Americans feel the cost of a distant war in their daily lives, through disrupted hospital services, through hacked infrastructure, through a creeping sense that nothing is truly secure, you shift the political calculus. Now let's return to the Halevi breach, because there are layers here that go well beyond the obvious. Handala's leak also included personal moments from Halevi's life, such as family photos and a video showing him hiding under a piano as a woman enters his living room. That detail is not accidental. Publishing intimate, even humorous personal moments alongside classified military intelligence is a very specific psychological strategy. It strips the target of the armor of institutional authority. It says to every senior Israeli official watching, we do not just have your secrets, we have your life, we have your family, we have your private moments, and we can release any of it anytime we choose. That is not intelligence gathering, that is psychological dominance, and it is working. The incident is being viewed as part of an aggressive psychological warfare campaign. Over the past 2 years, the group has targeted a string of high-profile Israeli officials, including former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, former IDF Chief of Staff Benny Gantz, and Tzaki Braverman, a former Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. In late March 2026, Handala leaked personal correspondence and documents from former Mossad Director Tamir Pardo's Gmail inbox, exposing residential addresses, phone numbers, and travel patterns. This is not a series of opportunistic hacks. This is a systematic, methodical campaign to map the entire upper tier of Israel's political and security establishment. Each breach builds on the last. Each data set enriches the intelligence picture. And the cumulative effect is that Iran may now possess one of the most comprehensive intelligence portraits of a foreign nation's leadership that any adversary has ever assembled through cyber means. This is not a collection of embarrassing leaks. This is a strategic intelligence operation of historic proportions. Security experts note that such breaches do not necessarily require penetration of classified military networks, which are typically isolated from the public internet. Instead, attackers often rely on more indirect methods, including social engineering and the exploitation of personal cloud services. And this is where the lesson gets deeply uncomfortable, not just for Israel, but for every government, every institution, every person in a position of power anywhere in the world who uses a personal phone connected to a cloud account. The vulnerability is not in the classified systems. The vulnerability is in the human being, in the convenience of a smartphone, in the habit of syncing your photos to Google or iCloud, in the reality that the most powerful people in the world are also, in their private lives, just ordinary people using ordinary consumer technology, and that technology is not designed with state-level adversaries in mind. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a significant joint offensive codenamed Operation Epic Fury and Operation Roaring Lion. In the hours following the initial strikes, Iran began a multi-vector retaliatory campaign, which has evolved into a significant trans-regional conflict, and it is within this context, this active multi-front war, that we need to understand what Handala is doing. This is not peacetime espionage. This is wartime intelligence operations conducted at a pace and a scale that most Americans have not been told about. Israel's intelligence collection effort, through its access to Tehran's traffic camera network, permitted meticulous pattern of live tracking of IRGC commanders and mapped the security posture of Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei's compound. So both sides are fighting this war in the digital shadows. Both sides are inside each other's systems to a degree that would astonish the public if it were fully disclosed. The difference is that Handala chooses to make its operations public because the publicity is itself a weapon. Handala is optimized for psychological and reputational disruption, breaking into low-hanging systems, conducting hack and leak activity, and timing the publication of stolen material to maximize pressure. The phrase low-hanging systems is worth unpacking. These are not fortress-like military networks that required exotic technical capabilities to crack. These are personal devices, personal email accounts, cloud storage, the everyday digital infrastructure of human beings who happen to hold extraordinary power. And that is actually the most alarming part of this entire story, not the sophistication of the attack, but the simplicity of the entry point. If the former chief of staff of one of the most technologically advanced militaries in the world is vulnerable through his personal phone and cloud accounts, then what does that say about the security of everyone else in positions of power? Handala has mounted attacks against Israel and other countries since December 2023, increasingly targeting American victims since US-Israeli airstrikes against Iran began on February 28. The American angle here is something that the US media has consistently underplayed, and it deserves far more attention. Because what we are watching is not a bilateral conflict between Israel and Iran that Americans are merely observing from a safe distance. American infrastructure has been hit. American companies have been targeted. American officials' communications have been in the crosshairs. US law enforcement confirmed that Iranian hackers operating under the name Handala compromised the FBI director's personal email. The FBI director, let that land properly. The head of America's premier domestic intelligence agency had his personal email compromised by this same group, and yet the American public has largely been kept in the dark about the true scale of this digital war being waged against their country's institutions. Around March 20th, the DOJ formally attributed Handala to Iran's MOIS, calling it a fake activist persona used for hack and leak and psychological operations. The formal attribution matters. It means the United States government officially acknowledges that what appears to be a grassroots hacktivist collective is in fact a branch of Iranian state intelligence, which means that every action Handala takes is an action by the Iranian government. Which means the release of Halevi's files is not just a hacking operation, it is an act of state-sponsored intelligence warfare conducted in public, designed to shape perceptions, undermine alliances, and demonstrate capability. And the timing, coming in the immediate aftermath of a ceasefire announcement by President Trump, is a message to Washington as much as it is a message to Tel Aviv. What is the broader meaning of all this? What does it tell us about the world we are living in right now? I think it tells us several things that we need to be honest about, even if they are uncomfortable. The first is that the concept of military secrecy, as we have traditionally understood it, is under profound and perhaps irreversible pressure. When the commanding general of a nation's armed forces cannot protect his own personal communications from a foreign intelligence service, the entire framework of operational security that military institutions have built over centuries needs to be fundamentally reconsidered. The second is that the line between civilian life and the battlefield has effectively disappeared in the cyber domain. In periods of geopolitical tension, cyber operations sit right next to missiles and airstrikes as a tool that states and state-linked groups use to inflict damage, probe weaknesses, and signal resolve to their enemies. The hospital supply chain in Michigan, the personal phone of an Army chief of staff, the email inbox of the FBI director, these are all part of the same battlefield now. The third thing it tells us, and this is perhaps the most important, is that the power structures of the world are not as stable or as impenetrable as they present themselves to be. We are fed a narrative of invincible military establishments, of intelligence agencies that see everything, of governments that are always in control. And then something like this happens. For years, Handala silently and relentlessly was right at the heart of Herzi Halevi's system, watching, recording, and collecting everything that matters, for years, during a war, at the highest level of command, and nobody caught it, or if they caught it, they said nothing, and the IDF has still not publicly commented. That silence, in the face of what may be the most serious intelligence breach in Israel's history, is telling us something about the gap between the image of power and the reality of power. And understanding that gap, honestly, clearly, without the fog of official narratives, is the beginning of actually making sense of this world.